Welcome to this clip on risk management. Information systems risk management and controls is an important area to ensure that we've understood the risks associated with the operation of an information system and then put in appropriate controls to protect that information system from those risks. When we're going to look at risk management, we must understand that information systems risk is only a subset of the risk to the business process that information system supports. When we consider information systems risk, it must always be considered in the context of the business. The failure of an information system is not necessarily measured by the impact on IT, but rather by the impact on that failure on the business. The idea of risk management is to then manage risk. We understand that risk is an essential part of business today. When we are in business, we do have risk, and we are not going to eliminate that risk. However, we are going to do our best to manage that risk, ensuring that undesired events will be hopefully prevented, and if not prevented, will at least properly detected and corrected. So what is risk? Risk is based on two things: probability, what's the likelihood or frequency of an adverse event happening, and the consequence, the impact if that were to happen. There are a number of very good risk management guidelines out there. For example, the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, has put out their standard then 31,000. This is used as a benchmark in risk management around the world. There are others then that indicate that risk is the measure of the extent to which an entity is threatened by a potential circumstance or event, and is typically then a function of several components. One, the adverse event impact that would arise if the circumstance or event were to occur, and the likelihood of that occurrence. This is defined in another well-known document, that is the NIST Special Publication 800-39. Information systems risk as related then to business risk. Information systems risk is usually measured using those three terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. In other words, if we had a breach of confidentiality, would that have a major, minor, or should we say no impact on the business at all? What if we had a breach of integrity, inaccurate information, or an incorrect process? What if the system was not available? In other words, that is a measure of criticality or availability. These are the three terms or yardsticks often used when we measure then information systems risk. As we saw before, information systems risk is a subset of business risk. Business risk then is measured by what would be the impact of that risk event on the goals and objectives of the business or of the organization. For the examination, the CISA candidate is not expected to know any single risk assessment or risk management methodology. However, we use an example here of the NIST special publication as a way to gain an understanding of the risk management process. We can see that risk management is made up really of four separate items. The first is to frame the risk. In the ISO 31000, they call this the context of the risk. What we do is we start by understanding the business, the environment in which the business operates, and therefore we look at the regulations, competition, environment, market conditions, personnel, all of these areas that certainly make up what would possibly be then the risk context or the risk environment. Because we are going to measure risk for our organization, we want to make sure that we've measured that risk accurately and in relation to what's important for our business. We understand that the risk to a law enforcement, to a military, to a government, or to a commercial enterprise are significantly different. We need to understand the business before we can understand the risk to that business. So once I've understood framing the risk, which will include understanding the business and the scope of the risk assessment effort, because in many cases we cannot conduct a risk across the entire organization. We're going to have to look at specific areas or specific systems. In some cases, it will be based on taking a look at specific then products or services we provide. The next step then is to assess the risk. To assess is to identify the risk and the elements that make up risk and provide a report that can be used then in risk response. The idea of risk assessment is the analysis and identification of the risk so that we can take the appropriate action when it comes to then risk response. As we see, the framing of the risk will also influence how the assessment is done, how we set out our priorities. The framing of the risk will also influence how we respond. What is our risk appetite, or what is our tolerance for risk? And we will then, once we have taken appropriate response, or as ISO 31000 calls it, risk treatment, we'll then move on to monitoring. Since risk conditions can change, we want to ensure that we monitor those risk conditions if necessary, so we can even restart a risk assessment. But again, we see that linkage between risk monitoring and the framing of risk. In this case, the risk monitoring will provide the reports back to management on the type of risk that we've faced. So let's take a look at how NIST does risk assessment. NIST says once we've understood the business, step one, we've prepared for the risk assessment by looking at the organization and its context for risk. We will then conduct the risk assessment. In order to conduct a risk assessment, I need to know, first of all, what I'm protecting. What are the assets of the organization? That will have been determined during the risk framing. Then I will look at what are the threat sources and events. What could happen to that asset? And many of these may be intentional or maybe accidental. They could be circumstantial. We could say that a risk threat source could be human, or it could be, of course, a natural event or just a equipment failure or a supporting utility failure, such as power. So we identify the threat sources, and then we look for what are the vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions for our asset. For example, a predisposing condition could be a poorly trained staff or an unpatched system. Once we've identified the vulnerabilities, we'll be able to also help determine the likelihood of occurrence. Obviously, if a threat source can take advantage of a well-known vulnerability, it's much more likely that we'll actually have a risk event. We'll also have to consider the presence or absence of controls, and how effective would those controls be in then deterring or mitigating the risk. This will help us to determine the magnitude of impact. How much damage would happen if this threat event was able then to exploit and damage that asset. Combining all of these together, asset value, threats, vulnerabilities, likelihood, and magnitude, will allow me now to determine the risk to that asset. Based on this, we will communicate what those risk levels are to management. So management is aware of what is our risk posture or risk position currently. We will also maintain an ongoing assessment, often through items such as a risk register, which will have a list of all the identified risks and their severity, as well as any actions undergoing then to address those risks. So we can see here how the risk formula evolves. We have a threat source, understanding in many cases the capabilities of the threat agent. The threat agent, if they are an advanced persistent threat, have tremendous skills, capability, funding, and motivation. And we understand the higher the level of motivation and the higher the capability of the threat source, the more significance the risk. Then we see the threat event. For example, the threat source may be a hacker. The threat event, the actions, the malware used by the hacker in the actual attack. So what happens? The threat source initiates a threat event. The threat event exploits a vulnerability or a predisposing condition within the asset. We could say that this will also determine the severity of this actual attack. It looks at, of course, whether or not this predisposing condition and vulnerability is well known, well documented, and whether or not the controls we have in place would be effective to mitigate the threat event. In some cases, there may be threat events. However, they would not be successful because the organization has appropriate controls to mitigate that threat. Where there has been a deficiency or a weakness, we are going to see then some degree of adverse impact. There's going to be some type of damage to that asset, which could be measured, of course, both in quantitative and qualitative measures. Quantitative being money, and qualitative looking at things such as reputation, brand, morale, customer confidence. So we understand here that when we've taken a look in this case at risk to an information system, that will also influence the organizational risk, how the organization itself, its mission, objectives, image, and reputation can be damaged by this risk event. This is an example of a risk event methodology, so we can understand how all of these terms fit together. So the purpose of risk assessment then is that I can identify the risks that I face, and this can support the development of our audit plan. So we quite often will do risk-based audit. Let's look at the areas of audit that have the highest level of risk. We can now implement effective controls where necessary to be able to then mitigate those risks. So the next step then, once I have assessed and documented my risk, and I've come out with some recommendations of what possibly could be done about it, is to move on then to risk response, or also called risk treatment. There are a few terms here we look at. We want to reduce our risk down to a level that we could accept or tolerate. Now, we've taken the initial level of total risk, but we have then mitigated that through various controls. And when we do that, we will still have some level of risk that remains. This is what we'll call our residual risk. Residual risk is the level of risk that remains after the implementation of a control. This is often needed when we're going to provide to management a report on the risk. What is the actual level of risk that we currently face? The next step is to decide if that residual risk is acceptable. It could be that people are willing to accept a risk up to a certain level. However, if that risk exceeds a certain threshold, then they are no longer willing to tolerate or accept that risk. Understanding the risk appetite of the organization can help us to provide guidance then in how to then address the risk that was then identified. We want to ensure that we have met with the requirements of the organization and achieved compliance then with certainly how to ensure that the risk our organization faces is acceptable. One of the rules of risk treatment is that we should never spend more to protect something than it's worth. So this is where we often will do cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis will look at the cost of a control or a method of mitigating risk as compared to the benefit that that control would provide. The idea, of course, of a cost-benefit analysis is we can examine various risk response options. We can take a look at what is available as a way to address the risk so that hopefully we can choose the best of those solutions. There are really four options for addressing risk. The first would be to avoid the risk altogether. For example, if I know that driving on a very icy road is dangerous, I may decide to avoid the risk and just not drive today. That is to cease or decide not to participate in the risk activity. Another option would be to transfer or share the risk. An example of this would be if I go in a partnership with another organization. So we both can work together on a project and we both would face the risk if that project failed. On the other hand, we can purchase insurance. And insurance is one way to transfer the risk to another party, in this case, the insurance company. In some cases, we just can live with the risk. We can accept it. To accept it, we understand that if something bad happens, it'll cost us whatever it costs, but it's an amount that we're willing, we could say here, to pay. Now, deciding to accept the consequence of the risk is very often a senior management decision, but that has to be made with a clear knowledge of what that risk is. We can see that in a number of cases, maybe a decision to accept risk was based on incomplete knowledge, where management did not really understand how much risk there was associated with this risk event. In the case of accepting the risk, management should also be aware if there are any regulations that also apply in that area. The fourth treatment option is to then attempt to reduce or mitigate the risk. We could mitigate or reduce the risk through the implementation of new controls, or perhaps to augment or enhance the controls we currently have. The idea of then reducing the risk will be to either reduce the likelihood of the event or the impact of the event. In most cases, we cannot reduce asset value, but we could try to reduce then the likelihood of that asset being compromised through better controls. Or we could reduce the impact or damage to that asset by containing and certainly addressing that risk quickly if it were to actually happen. Once we have decided on a risk treatment option, we must continue to monitor the risk as well. We know that risk is dynamic and is ever changing. This means that risk can easily be affected by changes in the operational environment, such as a new competitor, changes in technology, changes in laws and regulations, as well as, of course, the discovery of new vulnerabilities or weaknesses. New threats may emerge as well, and some of the controls we'd put in initially may not be as effective as they once were. For this reason, we need to continuously monitor our risk and report to management so they're aware of any significant changes in our current risk posture. So we report risk to management possibly on a scheduled basis, where we need to provide information on every quarter or every month. Or in other cases, we could report risk when an event happens, an ad hoc basis. This risk reporting is an essential part of governance. Management is responsible for the protection of the assets of the organization. And this responsibility can be defined as governance. The oversight, the management, and we can say that in order for management to be able to provide good governance, they have to have good information. So therefore we have risk reporting. This provides then management with the information on the current risk level, as well as the effectiveness of the controls and the impact of any past incidents. It also helps us to ensure that we are compliant with any laws or regulations that apply. In summary, risk management is a key component both of the business strategy, but also of setting out our audit plan and our audit strategy. Risk management itself is comprised then of understanding the context or framing the risk, performing the risk assessment, the identification and analysis of the risk, responding or treating the risk in the appropriate manner, and finally, risk monitoring, the ongoing monitoring and reporting on the risk that we face.